I'm Derek Robinson, a senior technical online course developer at InterSystems, and I'm joined by Brian Zakrzewski, a senior developer support engineer. And we're going to talk about running queries in Health Insight. To start, so Brian, what are some of the typical scenarios where you see users like data scientists, for example, running queries in Health Insight? And what are some of the most common issues or pitfalls that you see in those scenarios?
So I think the easiest way to describe this is kind of with an example. Like a couple of years ago, obviously we needed a lot of reporting on COVID-19 and everything to do with patient populations there. So you get all this patient information coming in from hospitals, everyone going into the HIE, and it's all over the place. Health Insight is there to put that data together. But off the top of my head, you need like demographic information like age, state, the facilities they were coming from, any vaccinations they've had, and even before going to anything else, that's like 3 or 4 different tables that you need to join together. And so those are the kinds of, aggregate patient populations and any downstream extra information you want to get on top of that. First, you got to figure out, well, we need this stuff. We need all the patients that belong to these groups, and then we can ask more questions about what happens with them. So, generally, that's a very large patient population, and then a little bit of extra on top of it. So it's kind of like 2 steps. First, you need to define who your cohort is, and then what other information you want.
Right, right. Nice, that makes
So
sense. Yeah.
pitfall-wise, though, the problem is people start getting into the weeds of what they want to add into it. And the more things you pile on to defining what the cohort is, like, oh, maybe I don't want to filter on these codes, but I want to include this range, and I want to do this other thing.
Yep.
And the more conditions you put, the harder and harder it is for an optimizer to really know exactly what you want out of that SQL query. The Iris platform is really good at doing a lot of stuff, but some of the queries that people write can push those algorithms to their limits.
Right.
So
right.
most of what Health Insight or really anything SQL-wise is using is statistical information. So if you want like a year's worth of data, if you've been around for 2 years, that's half your table. If you've been around for 50, that's only 2%.
Yeah.
You got to really know what you're doing before you do anything else.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, that kind of feels like it relates to the next question I had here, which is specifically looking at date queries. They can often cause performance issues in Health Insight. So, can you talk a little bit about how, first of all, why those can cause performance issues, and then also how users might be able to avoid challenges like that?
Yeah, so this one comes up specifically a lot in support. We've seen people do some things. As I mentioned, maybe you want the past year's worth of data. Everything is statistical, but we store all the dates fully as a timestamp. So that includes down to the millisecond, if that's the precision that it came in with. So that's a lot of unique values. Like even if you're in the same appointment, if you did 2 things at 2 different minutes for the lab results, they're going to be different times. And one of the things that makes it hard to estimate is to know how many different rows am I actually going to hit if I do a query on this range. And so when you have a lot of dates with very unique things, the date might look like a really good index to an optimizer, but it's actually going to be a huge amount of data, and you'd be better off picking something else. And so there's ways to mitigate that. A lot of them, usually it ends up being something like, okay, there's a hint you can put into your queries that just says ignore this index. If you know you're using a massive date, maybe just put that in there. Say don't use that, see what that is. And then if you want to work with any like platform developers who are working with the Iris and Health Insight systems at like development level, it's supported to add custom indices to things. A big one we usually recommend is stuff like you can add an index that's just on year. So instead of getting all that millisecond information, just do 2025, 2024, 2023. And that's a pretty commonly used field, which is why we get so much performance issues trying to figure out what's going on with them. But that's kind of the big thing is Health Insight can't do everything index out of the box, but it's very easy to customize and build that up if you know what you want ahead of time.
Right. Nice. Yeah, I think, talking a little bit more about that with these indices, what role do indices play in query performance for people that are less familiar with that, or maybe don't, actually understand the ramifications whenever they're using some of these indices? What role do the indices play in performance? And then can you provide any guidance on how users should determine when to use or avoid certain indices that are in these queries?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make a reference to a book originally, but I don't know how many people actually look at a book's index anymore in this day and age. But really, it's there. It's the shortcut you use to find just the data you want. And one of the major advantages of why it's performant is, especially for Iris, the index is a much smaller memory object. It's only got the field that you were indexing on, or fields if it's multiple. So there's a lot less for you to load from the disk, scan through it, loop over that, and figure out where you want to go next. Otherwise, you'd be pulling out all of the data, and if you look at the data in Model Health Insight, there's probably 100 columns or more for some of these tables, and you'd have to load all of that at once, scan, find the one you want, figure out if it's there, and then just keep going through that. So really, you want an index on anything that you would put in the where clause for a SQL statement.
Right.
So how you would use those, most of the time, the optimizer is going to do it for you. The biggest thing is making sure that they're there in the first place.
Yep.
And there's some good, nice different types of indices, which might be a little too technical to get into here. But for instance, bitmaps are a keyword you should look out for. They're really good for certain things like counts or doing intersections between a bunch of different indices of that type. It can make things super fast when you're doing things like that. If you know you're doing something very specific, like we often talk about things like an MRN and the assigning authority that goes with it, that's a pair of values, two different columns. You can define an index that's on both of those as a compound. And now you don't have to load the data and you don't have to calculate the intersection. You can just run right down the index you already have. So it really depends on the use case, but there's a bit of a back and forth because it's do you know what you want to be looking on? Do you have that index? And if you do have that index, just use it. If you don't, maybe talk to somebody before you start running a query, just because you're going to realize, oh, I've been waiting for 3 days for this to run because nothing I want is actually indexed right now.
Right.
There was another thing, avoiding them isn't really something you have to worry about too much. The optimizer usually is pretty good. And I think the most common example people use is if you're at, say, Mass General, most people are probably going to have their state be listed as Massachusetts. You don't necessarily want to index on state. We normally track statistics related to that, so it's probably not going to do that for you anyway. But if it's in sort of a gray area, then that's where another case where you might want to give it a hint and say, maybe this is the best one to use.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. It seems like whenever working with these, there's sort of this spectrum of you have some users who are going to be writing queries right away and others who are actually spending some more time figuring out what they want and making sure that they're doing some of that prep work. When thinking about that prep work, or even retroactively after they've tried, when should users take the next step of approaching their development teams, maybe to either ask for help with building their queries, and maybe like what type of information or requests might they bring to the developers on their team to implement in the system that can help them with the queries that they're trying to run?
I'd say the biggest thing is kind of determine first how often you're going to be using this, what your real business requirements are for what you're doing. If you're building a dashboard like the COVID-19 ones I mentioned before, you're going to be using that probably a lot. People are going to be asking a lot of questions about that. So if there is something you're using to define as your major criteria for that cohort and it's not already in an index, before you even do anything else, go talk to your developers, say, hey, we're going to be running on this a lot. We really should add something to do this. And it's very easy. It's well documented and supported to add stuff to Health Insight for any custom indices you need to add. And it's a lot easier in the planning stage to get that done than it is to be running it and realizing, well, we promised this last week and, now we need to rebuild everything.
Right. Exactly. That makes total sense. Last question here, wrapping it up. How can checking your query plans actually help to optimize the queries? Are there any practical tips and tools that are available within Health Insight to make this easier for users?
Yeah, so this isn't necessarily specific to Health Insight, but any query you want to run. So if you build your own tables to work alongside them or anything like that, this will still work. There's an explanation command just called explain. It's going to print out that query plan you mentioned, and it's really useful because, as we said, indices are the key to everything you're doing here. So it'll print out everything in a pseudo-algorithmic format. You can see, is that index being used? If it says it's using that index, great, you're good. If it says it's not using it, maybe take a step back and think about whether or not you expect it to be there. Maybe it's doing something smarter. Maybe it's not. Maybe there's something that's a problem and you need to give it some hints or talk to some people about that. And it's kind of, you want to know not necessarily how it's going to do all the dirty work of getting that query, but you should have an idea in your head of what you would want your query to do. And the more that lines up with what the query plan says it's going to do, the safer you'll feel when you run it. And usually that's going to be a good starting point.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. Well, Brian, thanks so much. This has been super helpful.
Yeah, happy to help.